Well, today, on what would have been John Lennon's 51st birthday, a writer has put together an account of the final days before Lennon's tragic murder. John's allegedly morbid, violent fantasies, his missing diaries, and his supposedly manipulative wife, Yoko. Frederick Seaman, Lennon's one-time personal assistant, charges also that Yoko twice blocked this controversial memoir. But her longtime friend and associate, Elliot Mintz, who will join us also via satellite, tells us why he thinks this tell-all is a pack of lies. Lennon was a dear friend of mine, a guy who did something incredible for me in a charity that I represented here in New York called 1-to-1. He did the last fully rehearsed concert of his life and raised tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for the mentally retarded. And he was assisted every step of the way by his wife, who was even then a controversial person, Yoko Ono. Now, as I mentioned, there is this very controversial memoir about the final days of Lennon, so controversial that one of the New York papers, when it first came out, put the story on the front page. You can see the New York Post, new book reveals John and Yoko's dark secrets. The author, Fred Seaman. Fred, tell us exactly what your role was. I mean, how do you know the things that you purport to know about the Lennons in their last days?
Well, I was with John almost every day for the last 20 months of his life. I was hired as his personal assistant in 1979, and I was with him until he died in 1980.
What does a personal assistant do? Tell us.
When Yoko hired me, she described the job as cooking brown rice and answering the fan mail, and I learned that there was much more to it. It was a two-part job. Half of it was hanging out with John, being his companion, spending his money, being his conduit to the outside world. The other half was being downstairs in Yoko's office, answering the phones, opening the mail, and doing her paperwork.
Tell us briefly, is the headline correct? Were the last days of John's life before his murder at the hand of Mark David Chapman, were the last days dark days?
I think they were. I think that John was trapped in a loveless and sexless marriage, and that headline that you pointed to sensationalized that aspect of the book, and we're only talking about less than a page in a 260-page book, really. But unfortunately, the media really laps up anything.
Before you attack the media, I've read the book too. It seems there are quite a few very disturbing allegations in there. For instance, about their chronic drug use during those days. Is that what you saw?
I wouldn't say their chronic drug use. What I say in the book is that Yoko used heroin consistently. John, the only drug that he was truly addicted to, from what I could tell, was nicotine. He was a chain smoker almost. He smoked marijuana from time to time. He took psychedelic mushrooms, but he wasn't really a chronic drug user, I would say.
You say that Yoko tried to squash this book, to keep it off, keep it out of publication. Is that true?
That is true, yes.
What did she do?
Well, I had a book deal in 1983 with Simon & Schuster, and at the time I had pled guilty to a count of grand larceny in connection with my taking John Lennon's journals out of the Dakota, and I had pled guilty to one account of a Class D felony, I think it was, and I was sentenced to 5 years probation.
So you are unique among the biographers in that you have pled guilty to stealing the material that perhaps was the basis of your book.
But it was not the basis for the book, you see. My book is based on my journals, and I could document this because eventually Simon & Schuster sued me for fraud, and I countersued them, and I produced to them, I gave them copies, over 1,000 pages of my journals, so eventually they satisfied themselves that my book was based on my journals, and they dropped their suit.
Let me go. We only have the satellite with Elliot Mintz for 10 minutes or so, so I really want to get his side of the story represented right away. What you've heard so far, Elliot, why don't you respond?
Well, it doesn't sound like the John Lennon and Yoko Ono that I knew. I met them in 1971. I've known Yoko now for about 20 years, and I was with John for 10. The last few weeks, months, and year of John's life was one of the happiest of all possible times. He and Yoko were very, very much in love. They were celebrating the birth and growth of their young son, Sean, who will be 16 years old today as well. They had just completed their album, Double Fantasy. Life was at its zenith and peak. The description that Fred Seaman just gave you of, and the stuff contained in his book is really nonsense.
What do you think of what Seaman says about this larceny charge. What's your view? What is Yoko's view? I know you were speaking with Yoko last night. Tell us your side.
Well, Fred uses the word larceny. Let's just really define what it was that Fred did. Fred stole John Lennon's personal journals, his personal diaries. He took them out of the Dakota without permission. In addition to that, Fred had a warehouse in Midtown Manhattan where when the police arrested him, they also seized a number of other possessions belonging to John Lennon. Stereo equipment, files, letters, handwritten lyrics of Yoko's. Fred Seaman was involved in a criminal conspiracy involving at least 2 other people called Project Walrus. And Project Walrus was in part a scheme designed to steal the diaries and sell them privately. Fred Seaman's time with John Lennon was precious little, and I'm here to suggest that the material in Fred's book on the actuality scale of accuracy between 1 and 10, 10 being accurate, is somewhere between 1 and sliding off the scale.
Fred, speaking as you do from the disadvantage of someone who has actually pled guilty to a felony, why don't you respond to
Okay, first of all, before I respond to that, Geraldo, I would like to make it very clear that Elliot Mintz is a paid publicist for Yoko Ono, a job that he's had for 15 years. He is very well paid for this appearance. It is his job.
He's not being paid for this appearance.
Not by you, but by Yoko.
And I've only represented her for 10.
Excuse me?
I've only represented her for 10, but so far you're running about 50-50 in accuracy.
Let me just conclude that it is his job to attack anyone who says things in public that are perceived as being critical of Yoko Ono.
I'm not attacking Fred. I'm simply
Can I just finish,
facts.
Elliot, before you interrupt me? I didn't interrupt you, and I won't interrupt you, so please do me the same courtesy. Let me finish.
You're right, I'm sorry.
As far as his charge that other things that I had stolen, other things, they are not true. I did have a storeroom, but there was nothing there taken that did not belong to...
Wait a second. I've seen an inventory. Jim Bob, give me the inventory on the full screen.
This was
please.
the inventory supplied to us by the New York City Police Department.
And it wasn't from a warehouse in Manhattan. It was actually from your apartment.
The cops did ransack my apartment.
In Brooklyn.
Yes.
It included video cassettes, audio cassettes, transcripts, Xerox copies of the 1979 and 1980 journals, a painting of John Lennon, a drawing by Sean Lennon, 7 manila folders containing notes, correspondence, and writing, musical instruments, stereo equipment.
Okay, can I respond to that in detail, please?
That's a police inventory.
Yes. The cassettes that were taken, they were copies of Double Fantasy. I think they were talking about 2 cassettes of Double Fantasy. The videotape was a videotape called Walking on Thin Ice, which I was involved in the production of. I was in the videotape. The papers that were taken were shopping lists that John had written to me, some of which I reproduce in the book. I forget the other stuff. I've never seen that list, by the way, and this is the second time that it surfaced on the Larry King show last Friday, some time ago.
Give me the Xerox copy that we have, please, Mike.
And Geraldo, if I might add, there are 2 copies. There's one list of things of stolen property that were taken from Fred's Brooklyn apartment. There's another inventory sheet taken from the storage facility in Midtown Manhattan, including John's personal stereo.
So, Fred, your book may be totally accurate, but you sit there a convicted thief. True?
I did plead guilty to taking John's 1979 journal.
To a felony conviction.
Yes,
I mean,
yes, I did.
Like you
it's not a secret. It's in the book.
I
I admit it. I explained the circumstances.
You do admit it on the last page of the book. I know.
Not on the last page. In the last
page
section.
before the epilogue.
In the afterword.
The afterword.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. That's not saying that you're a liar. I mean, it's just saying that you're a thief.
I'm not a liar. I'm telling the truth. The book stands for itself.
All right. It's the book we're discussing right now, The Last Days of John Lennon, a personal memoir by Frederick Seaman, a man who worked for at least 2 years in the Dakota, the fabled building, the scene of Rosemary's Baby, where John and Yoko lived the last, how many years of their life?
I think they moved in there in around the mid-1970s, maybe 73.
All right, you describe, why don't you quickly describe some of the adjectives that you apply to Yoko Ono?
Adjectives?
Yeah.
I think it's fair to describe her as manipulative. I think she used John.
Didn't John love her?
He did, yes.
It seemed to me, let me just say, and I'm going to let Elliot talk, that's really his role, not mine. I saw them 6 weeks before John was killed at 64th Street in Central Park West, right out front of my apartment, and we had a conversation. We hadn't seen each other or spoken for probably 5 years since John had a so-called lost period on the West Coast. And I have to say that Elliot's assessment, at least in my conversation with him on the street, appears correct. Sean, their baby, was a source of enormous joy. Double Fantasy was already on the charts and moving pretty quickly. John in my estimation, seemed happier than he had probably for 7 or 8 years.
Yes, but you see, Geraldo, the John Lennon that you saw was the public John Lennon. That is what he put out to the outside world. Inside the Dakota, it was a very different picture. It was a very grim picture, and one that Elliot knows to be true, because even though he wasn't there as much as he claims he was there a few times during my 2 years that I was there, he knows that it's true. And of course, he is paid to promote the myth of John and Yoko as the Romeo and Juliet of the 1960s. But it is just a myth. The reality was very sad, unfortunately.
Elliot?
Geraldo, I won't even deal with that nonsense. The suggestion being that when he met you on the street, he was doing a public relations job in a street corner. All of this is nonsense. What I ask our audience to do, both in television and in your studio, is the following. Pay no attention to Fred Seaman. He's just a guy hawking another book. Pay no attention to Elliot Mintz. He is right. I do represent the Lennon estate, and Yoko Ono is my best friend. I love her and respect her. What I would ask you to do is just this. Listen to John Lennon. His final interview that he did for Archeo General the day of his death, he talked about his absolute love for Yoko and his son Sean. The interview that he did the day before for the BBC, he talked for hours. The David Sheff interview in Playboy magazine, published in December of 1980, the same. Either Fred believes that John was an honest, real human being, which I know most of us share, or that John was an absolute total fraud with a woman who he didn't love. The hypothesis is crazy and bizarre. In the end, it'll be... I'm almost through, Fred. Stand by. In the end, it'll be John Lennon's music and his memory and his integrity that will prevail, and Fred will be just another one of a pathetic list of people trying to cash in on John's life.
John Lennon was not a fraud, but sadly, the Ballad of John and Yoko, Double Fantasy, was a fraud. John Lennon, in those last interviews, sad to say, lied. He promoted the party line. The party line was that he was the house husband upstairs with Sean baking bread. Yoko downstairs, the brilliant business brain, you know, making money hand over fist. That is just that. It's a party line. It's not true. I was there. I know it not to be true. And there are others who were there. For instance, Mike Medeiros, Doug McDougal, the bodyguard, my Aunt Helen, who was Sean's nanny, my Uncle Norman. Many people who were there, who were members of the inner circle, know that I'm telling the truth.
Geraldo.
Okay, Elliot, we're going to lose the bird, so this is the last we'll hear from you, so make it good.
Let the folks choose for themselves. Put a John Lennon record on your turntable. Listen to his music, look into his eyes. You'll know the truth.
Okay, thanks, Elliot Mintz. I interviewed Yoko, the last time I interviewed her was on Entertainment Tonight. I think we have a brief clip where I asked her about being the dragon lady, so-called, being this evil influence that destroyed... we can't hear from John on that issue, but we certainly can hear from Yoko. Jim Bob, why don't you roll that clip? This,
Were you ever the dragon lady?
Dragon lady. Well, I don't know what dragon lady means, but dragon probably symbolizes something that is unique and very strong, and if that's what it is, I'm honored.
Well, that's Yoko's response on the dragon lady charge. I'm not... you may briefly one more time, then we're going on to Mary Wilson.
This is the big list of stuff that I...
There's 2 pages. I got another page here.
Reading from this page, at the top it says, Sony video cassette, Badlands. That was a movie. I don't know why the cops took that. 2 Scotch color video cassettes, Beatles. I think that was my copy of Hard Day's Night. Then there was cassette copies of Woman and Walking on Thin Ice, which I helped in the production, and I was in Walking on Thin Ice.
But you didn't own it.
I did own it. I did own it.
Then why'd you let him take it? Well, what about here? Here, you got all these... you have Manila Folder, Yoko Ono, Rough Lyrics, 1974 Manila Folder, John's correspondence from 68 and 69. That certainly doesn't belong to you. A lot of this stuff, by the way, is also fabricated. Yoko Ono's writings, 1974, Yoko Ono's publishing royalties.
That was not found. That was not found.
Why are they listed here? Is this a phony?
Yes, it is a phony, and I'll tell you why. Because I was picked up by 2 of Yoko Ono bodyguards. I was beaten by then. I had a gun put to my head. I think you have a photo of one of the cops who beat me up.
If we do,
a police sergeant named Barry Goldblatt, who is a member, still a member of the police force. Later, afterwards, they turned me over to the cops, and that's when I learned that not only were they bodyguards for Yoko Ono, but they were actually New York City policemen. And I was told in no uncertain terms by the detectives at the 20th Precinct that unless I cooperated, they could not guarantee my safety. I took the cops down to my apartment without a search warrant because one of Yoko's bodyguards had the keys to my apartment, and I was told if I didn't take didn't take the detectives down there, Yoko's guys would go there. That's why I took the detectives there. Once they were there, they had like 2 shopping bags, and they just started going through everything and throwing anything in there. And to this day, I don't know exactly what was taken.
Well, that list apparently
indicates. This is not what was taken. Other things were taken that are not on this list.
But
Things
Fred,
that belong
if everything
to me.
you say is true, then you must have had the worst lawyer in the world because you pled guilty.
Yes, I did.
Pled guilty not only to plead guilty.
I had one of the world's, and I filed an affidavit
against him. You pled guilty to a felony.
Yes.
Okay, my question is directed to this gentleman here, Fred. Isn't it true that John Lennon left Yoko Ono and her son for another woman and moved in with this lady? Because I seen this on another talk show, so I have to agree with you.
It must be false then. I don't know.
No, it was. I saw this on a talk show.
She did. They did break up in the mid-70s.
It's true. Yoko, John did break up with Yoko for 18 months and went to the West Coast with May Pang.
That was before Sean was conceived.
Yes, and the interesting thing about that is that it was Yoko who suggested to May that she go with John because this was around the time that John and Yoko's sex life collapsed, and Yoko wanted to recruit May Pang as John's concubine. She didn't realize, though, that May would fall in love with John and that the 2 of them would run off.
Right. How'd you get hired?
Yes. My uncle, Norman Seaman, was one of Yoko's oldest friends in New York. He's known her since 1960. My aunt, Helen, was Sean's nanny. I happened to be graduating from college when they were looking for an assistant, and as luck would have it, my birthday is a day after John's, October 10th. So as far as Yoko was concerned, that was all the qualification I needed.
Wasn't here today to defend herself.
I'd like to know that, too, why I have to talk to Elliot Mintz, who gets paid a lot of money
but
to
why? What's the difference?
Me.
Yoko doesn't want to honor your book with her appearance. We asked. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time. Bye-bye.